So in this video, we're going to be discussing the legacy of racism. And the first argument regarding the legacy of racism that we're going to discuss is the racism argument. The racism argument goes that racism is immoral, affirmative action is a form of racism, therefore affirmative action is immoral. So this is an argument that might be made against affirmative action on the basis that affirmative action is racism. What might be some counters to the racism argument against affirmative action? A first counter might be that racism is not immoral. So we may just reject the claim that it's always immoral to be racist. It may be possibly sometimes moral to be racist, according to this counter. We might consider this a fairly implausible counter, mainly because racism is widely considered very immoral, according to modern moral standards. And in order to make the counter case, we would be going greatly against the grain of those intuitions that most people have against racism. A second counter, which might be a more plausible counter, is that affirmative action is not a form of racism. So under this counter, we would be saying that affirmative action actually doesn't require us to do anything that would count as racism, so it's not racially discriminatory. People are going to argue that affirmative action is racially discriminatory because it requires that we make determinations based on race, right? We make these affirmative determinations that some races that had been marginalized in the past should now be receiving more benefits because of that past marginalization. And the argument is that this would be where the racism is coming in, that we're making these racial discriminations. This is actually the racism. But the counter to that would be that, no, we are not actually, affirmative action, when we implement it, is not actually making discrimination based on races. What it's doing is making a discrimination based on these prior historical marginalizations. And if those prior historical marginalizations happen to fall along the lines of race, then that's incidental to the purpose of affirmative action. The purpose is not the racism. The purpose is to improve those historical injustices, those and allow for the demarginalization of those people who were marginalized. That could be a reasonable counter to the affirmative action is racism claim. A second argument is the qualifications argument. And it goes, fairness requires that positions should be awarded solely on the basis of merit, that is, of who is best qualified for the position. Affirmative action does not award positions solely on the basis of an applicant's qualifications, but instead partly on the basis of racial or ethnic identity. Therefore, affirmative action is unfair. So again, we have an argument against affirmative action, and the argument is now based on the idea of qualifications being fairly rewarded. So what might be some counters to the qualifications argument? A first counter might be that fairness does not require that positions should be awarded solely on the basis of merit. So maybe merit is not a consideration that we should actually take into account. Or more plausibly, maybe merit is just one qualification that we should take into account amongst a variety of considerations when we are considering somebody for a position. A second counter might be affirmative action does award positions solely on the basis of an applicant's qualifications, not partially on the basis of racial or ethnic identity. So this counter would seem to be most likely implausible, just because when we talk about affirmative action, we simply are talking about policies that award positions based on features that are related to racial or ethnic identities. So the historical marginalization of people can be related to their racial or ethnic identity. And so that historical marginalization is in some sense a correlate or a proxy for that racial or ethnic identity. And it seems implausible to say that affirmative action is not doing that. That's just what we mean when we say affirmative action is that's what we are doing. So that's a less plausible counter unless you wanted to drastically redefine what you mean by affirmative action. Another argument is the equal opportunity argument. And it goes, a society is morally required to provide its citizens with equal opportunity to gain valuable resources and positions. If a policy helps society meet its moral requirements, then the policy is morally legitimate. Affirmative action helps to achieve such equal opportunity, therefore affirmative action is morally legitimate. So here we have an argument in favor of affirmative action on the basis of some requirement of equal opportunity. So what might be some counters to the equal opportunity argument? A first counter is that a society is not morally required to provide its citizens with equal opportunity to gain valuable resources and positions. So maybe there just is no such moral requirement. Maybe the moral requirements are based on something else, not equal opportunity, but some kind of weighted opportunity or something like that. Or maybe a society simply doesn't have moral requirements related to people's opportunities. Maybe people's opportunities are in some sense amoral or something like that. Now, we don't usually consider that the case, at least in modern democracies. We tend to think there is at least some obligation of society to guarantee equal opportunities. But to what extent might be open for debate. A second counter might be that a policy helps society meet its moral obligations, but the policy is not morally legitimate. So perhaps some policies help with moral requirements, but those policies actually violate some other moral requirement and thus are not morally legitimate. Maybe some policies are, in a sense, moral requirements, but they are actually not requirements that a government should be upholding. Maybe governments are more limited in their moral requirements, and those moral requirements actually belong to specific persons. The third counter might be that affirmative action doesn't help achieve such equal opportunity. So you might make the claim that affirmative action is actually harming equal opportunity by somehow skewing the results in favor of one group over another. Now, this one seems like something that would be very debated in the sense that it seems that those who take on affirmative action as a good, they do describe themselves in the terms of attempting to achieve some kind of equal opportunity. So you might have to show how that equal opportunity is not being achieved effectively by the policy. And that would be something that would come down to the details of any given policy, perhaps. Another argument is the reparations argument. And it goes, if one party has imposed systematic harms on members of a targeted group, then the wrongdoer is morally required to provide reparations to victims. The U.S. government has imposed systematic harms on members of at least two targeted groups, Native Americans and African Americans. Therefore, the U.S. government owes reparations to Native Americans and African Americans. So here we have an argument in favor of reparations for groups that have been harmed in the past. So what might be some counters to the reparations argument? A first counter might be that a party has imposed systemic harms on members of a targeted group, but the wrongdoer is not morally required to provide reparations to the victims. So maybe we actually don't think that repairing injustices, repairing harms, is a good thing. Maybe we don't think that. It does seem like most of us do think that to some extent, at least, because that seems to be very much how our court systems are based. Our systems of justice seem to entail some kind of an obligation to repair harms. So this first counter doesn't seem particularly plausible. We might run a second counter that the U.S. government has not imposed systemic harms on members of targeted groups. So this counter would come down to a question of the history of the situation. We would look at historically, were these groups harmed? Were they not? To what extent were they harmed? Now that still has a question attached to it, which is that, well, these groups may have been harmed in the past, but in what sense can we trace that harm to groups present in the future? And if we are considering the harms of the past as they affect groups in the future, is there a particular sense in which that harm has been transmitted, and to what extent has it been transmitted, and what would be the appropriate response to or reparation for harms transmitted in that way? And those are open questions, even if we do in fact find that the U.S. government has harmed targeted groups. It's still an open question as to how that could best be repaired.